Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another webinar with SPJIMR's Center for Financial Studies. This one is in collaboration with the Center for Social and Economic Progress. And it's my absolute pleasure and privilege to bring to you Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who's currently the President and Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi. Dr. Rakesh Mohan needs no introduction at all, one of the finest economists we have in the country. He's come back from the US recently from the Yale University. Welcome back, Dr. Mohan. Great to have you back. And a very quick introduction about Dr. Mohan. A long and illustrious career. He started off with a BSc in electrical engineering from the Imperial College London. Went on to do his economics, BA in economics from Yale. And a PhD in economics again from Princeton. So absolute blue blood, long career in World Bank, joined as a senior consultant in the Planning Commission in India around 1980s, worked with the likes of Dr. Manmohan Singh, 2 stints at the RBI as Deputy Governor, 2002-2004, and then 2005-2009. In between, he was Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs. He was also the Chief Economic Advisor. Thereafter, he went on to work with McKinsey, a stint at Stanford University, IMF, you name it. So, and also was till recently a professor at Yale. So great to have you, Dr. Rakesh Mohan, and I hope you can hear us clearly. In these days of webinars, unfortunately, we have to test the audio and video first to make sure everything is fine.
Yes, I hope you can. Thank you very much, Ananth, for that very kind introduction. I can be heard all right and seen?
You're perfectly audible, sir, so thank you. So great. What we'll be discussing is an essay which Dr. Mohan has written recently, which hopefully will come up in the website of CSEP from the next week. It's a paper which is titled "A Third Generation Strategy for Accelerated Growth and Development in India." I had the privilege of getting a sneak preview thanks to Dr. Rakesh Mohan. And as I said, hopefully it will come up in the public domain the next week. Thereafter, it's also going to be a part of a larger book which contains essays in honor of Dr. Ishar Judge Ahluwalia. We're going to speak about this third generation strategy for accelerated growth and questions around that. So Dr. Rakesh Mohan, I'm going to start with the first question, which is the basic question which I'm sure my students would have for you. What do you mean by third generation reforms? What were the first generation and second generation reforms that we now refer to third generation reforms?
Thank you, Ananth, once again for your kind, excessively kind introduction. I think what people should take from introduction is that I can't hold a job very long. I always have to move. So I will get thrown out or something like that. And then I find other jobs to do. I've said third generation, but partly to place emphasis on the fact that the first generation of reforms really took place just after independence. And so that will come as a surprise to many and as reforms. So we have to remind ourselves that Indian growth was almost zero for a century, perhaps before independence. And so what was ushered in after independence was indeed a total departure from previous practice. And so it was indeed a first generation reforms. And it did lead to a beginning of a major transformation of the Indian economy, even though unfortunately it has been labeled as the Hindu rate of growth of 3.5%. But 3.5% actually was around 4% for 15 years, the 50s and to the mid 60s. So 4% average growth over 15 years after almost a century of zero is really a major departure. So that's why I label as a first generation. And what the first generation did, of course, was a very heavy focus on initiating Indian growth, economic growth, from the highest level, that is the Prime Minister Nehru. And of course, the instrument that was used to do that was to set up the Planning Commission and initiate 5-year plans. And the whole rationale for that was, I suppose, a realization that you needed top level focus on the primary objective, and then set up an institutional system for coordination both across central government ministries and state governments, and give a certain direction to the state governments as well. Further, that it was setting this, it was making clear what the economic strategy was right from the top. And the Planning Commission to some extent was used to do a lot of consultation and get consensus. And of course, it was focused on import substitution, also give the government a major role in the economy, including public sector investment, big role for public sector etc. So, but that approach is broadly consistent with the mainstream thinking during those times. However, that did well for about 12, 15 years, and then it sputtered. And then we actually had sputtering growth about 15 years. There was some renewal in the 1980s. And then finally, the second generation reforms took place. In my view, about 15 or 20 years too late. But nonetheless, second generation reforms took place starting in 1991. And once again, what was common? What was common was that this departure was also characterized by a comprehensive approach to the whole economy, with the reforms touching almost every aspect of the economic system, but perhaps not so much in agriculture and social sector, which I will talk about a little more later. But India was then finally catching up, perhaps about 15 years late, 20 years late, relative to the change in strategy the rest of the world had adopted. But the bedrock of the public sector domination of industry and manufacturing. And once again, a new dynamic took place in the Indian economy, and we went up to something between 6 and 7% average growth for the following almost 20 years. Right. And once again, the same thing has happened, that the growth has sputtered after around 20 years, say the last 10 years or so, I would say from 2010, 12 or something from that period. Very clearly, growth has slowed down since 2012. Slowed down, investment growth has slowed down, slowed down after the first 15 years. Same thing has happened. The investment that what was really powered high growth in the 90s and early 2000s was high growth in investment, which again has sputtered. So those are the first and second generation of reforms. And just to summarize on that, that because the economy is now, and I believe, in trouble, it has slowed down all through, and all sectors of the economy have slowed down. And I'm abstracting here from COVID. I won't mention COVID in this particular discussion because that's going on. We don't know where it's going to end. So I'm abstracting from that. So now to come to the third generation, the main organizing principle of most reforms carried out since the early 1990s has really been the objective of freeing the private sector from the myriad government controls that had hobbled its performance for a long time. And this is still some distance to go. I'm not saying everything has been done. It's still some distance to go. But what has happened is that it did unleash a whole lot of entrepreneurial energies in the country. And India has indeed been transformed as a consequence. And hence, the title of my edited book with 30 authors called India Transformed, which came out about 3 years ago. But so now the come to third generation of reforms. What I believe now is that we seem to have reached the limit of private sector-led acceleration investment and output structure and governance. And I believe that the private sector now is being increasingly constrained by the lack of public investment in both physical and social infrastructure, and many other issues to do with law and order, general governance, etc. So, to summarize on what I mean by third generation reforms, I therefore believe, and this is really the key, that just as the second generation reforms empowered the private sector to perform as it can to the limits of its abilities, the third generation reforms must focus on a similar empowerment of the public sector, very broadly defined. But public sector, I don't mean public sector enterprises. I mean public sector, central government, state governments, local governments, regulatory authorities, public authorities, etc., to deliver public goods and services efficiently for the benefits of all segments, the public sector, the private sector, the corporate sector, and of course, particularly the people at large. I want to end by just saying, look, I don't want to be misunderstood, that I'm not advocating greater empowerment of the government and increase in control of the economy at all. Nor am I advocating public sector involvement in business. What I mean by public sector is all levels of governments that deliver services at all levels: national, state, local, public authorities, etc. Sorry to be long-winded, but it's difficult to put all those thoughts together without explaining.
With your Wi-Fi, I don't know if you can do much about it. Your voice tends to go off in between. So.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the voice and the video, but that's okay. We'll manage with what we have. So here are a couple of linked questions from that excellent overview that you've provided us on the first and second generation, Dr. Mohan. One is, why do we need this change now? What are the key problems that we're trying to address? And linked to that, you're right, compared to what we were prior to independence, we have seen growth, both in the first generation and in the second generation. Yet, if we were to compare ourselves with other peers, and the obvious names which come up are ASEAN countries, China, and so on and so forth, we seem to have underperformed them. So linked questions, what is it that has allowed other countries to outpace us in terms of growth and in terms of human development? And therefore, what is it that changes that you're asking for, and what are the key problems that you're looking to address in the third generational reform?
Yeah, so we need to do something now, in some sense, for the following reasons. One thing that has become very, very clear is the problem of employment in the country.
Sure.
That we just have not been generating adequate employment over this whole, for the last 20 years, even actually, in all spheres. So that's becoming more and more clear. Also, if we compare ourselves to East Asia, our per capita income is just about $2,000 per capita, maybe 2,100 or thereabouts. Maybe it has come down because of COVID, but again, I'm ignoring that. Now, China was only $10,000. And but Thailand is not that different. So it's not just China. So the one way I think about it is that even if we grow at a high rate, that is, say, 7% per capita, for the next 20 years, means 2 doublings, that even by 2040, late 2030s, we will just reach around $8,000 per capita. Let's say $10,000 per capita. In other words, even if we do very well, we will reach where China is today. And what has happened on the border over the last few months is also telling us that it's really the economy that we have to strengthen so that we are seen as a strong nation. So if one can go on into many more details, but to my mind, that this is a warning signal to us that we need to again refocus our energies. Because I do believe that what has happened, I would say the last 10, 12 years or so, that one doesn't get the feeling that the government, this government or the previous government for that matter, that had lost focus in terms of really emphasizing economic growth as the key objective, and then arranging everything else to do that.
Right. So clearly you're asking for a huge focus on growth. And
so that's the first issue. That is.
Yeah, go ahead, sir. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah. I can be heard because I'm getting a signal. My internet is unstable.
It is kind of unstable, but that's okay. I can hear you now.
Yeah. Just give me 1 second.
Sure.
Okay. I've opened the door where the router is, so I hope that
Okay.
makes a difference.
That normally works.
Okay. Yeah. So then on the question of the East Asian countries, um, number one, let me just mention how we've come to look at these things. That the last 4 years was at Yale. I was teaching one course called Strategies for Economics over the last number of years, over the last 5 decades, actually, 6 decades, in fact, since the 50s. Therefore, but I focused on the strategies used by the most successful countries.
Right.
And something that was in common was the most successful countries, number one, was this overarching focus on growth, articulated consistently at the highest policy levels, and then supported by adequate institutional arrangements to carry them out. And those institutional arrangements included some kind of planning body, the president's office, the prime minister's office, giving the focus. There's some kind of planning body coordinating, also a very active role, particularly for ministries of finance and industry, and all working in a coordinated fashion. And along with that, great degree of coordination of the private sector. So those are common characteristics. And one can see also that each of these countries, China, Japan, Korea, and others, Taiwan for that matter, continued with these arrangements. The planning body equivalents were functioning and powerful, I would say, till they reached level of between $5,000 and $10,000 per capita. They did not abandon them at $2,000 per capita, as we seem to have. Also, if you look at China, of course, they also renamed their planning body, and it's now called the NDRC, National Development Reforms Commission. So not very different from the renaming of Niti Aayog. So in that sense, we are similar. So that is number one. Number two, that the focus on manufacturing was much more employment oriented and export oriented, and the two went together. And again, that is something that's been different in our case. Also, there was a good degree of focus on enhancing productivity in nature. And all of these things went together. Third, in some sense, most important, which I'm focusing much more today, which in my own work earlier I've not focused on at all, and I'm not an expert at all, is that the other thing that comes out is that they also had particular focus on the provision of health and education on a universal basis. And if you look at Japan, they actually did that in the late 19th century. So this is the one area where we performed very poorly on a consistent basis. That is, whether it was the planning period, I feel very puzzled by that actually. We have never had a focus on health, education, water supply, and sanitation. I can testify to that almost personally in that when I first came back to the Planning Commission in 1986, in Rajiv Gandhi's government, I was advisor, among other things, unimportant position in the Planning Commission. There's absolutely no interest in water supply and sanitation. So that's just a reflection that we have never given this attention right from the beginning. Perhaps that has changed to some extent now with Swachh Bharat and Ayushman Bharat and the national education policy, etc. But it still remains to be seen how well all these programs will be delivered.
Right. Again, great overview, Dr. Mohan. So if I got you right, you mentioned planning and this focus on growth, right? It's almost this religious focus on growth.
Yes.
You talked about employment and manufacturing, labor-intensive employment. You talked about this universal provision of education, nutrition, healthcare, sanitation, etc. All these sound like very basic realities which any government would want. Why would one not want to focus on growth? Why would one not want to focus on employment? We've had planning commissions for a long, long time. Of course, now we've got renamed to something else, but we've had it for a long, long time. Why is it that delivery of basic sanitation, nutrition, healthcare, or employment or growth has not translated in India the way it has in East Asia or other countries?
Well, first thing, what is interesting, by the way, is that the two episodes that I mentioned, 1950 to 65, and then 1991 to say 2010, there wasn't what distinguishes those periods of the different governments at that time was indeed a particular focus on economic growth and mechanisms from the top for coordinating government actions. And so those things were missing between 1965, I would say, to the late 90s, late 80s, early 1990s. And I again perceive the same focus having gone.
Dr. Mohan, can I
early?
Sorry to interrupt, Dr.
I'm
Mohan.
frozen, is it?
Yeah, you're frozen. So can I suggest you switch off the video? We would love to see you, but let's give this a shot because the audio goes frozen as well. So let's give this a shot. Go ahead, sir. Can you hear me, Dr. Mohan?
I can hear you.
Yeah. So you were saying that we did have a focus between 1991 and 2010,
yes,
and in up to 1965 or so, right?
Yes. And so what I'm saying is that what you said, look, it's pretty obvious that government should have that focus. Doesn't it always have it? The answer is it doesn't always have it. And every time that has had that focus, we've seen a change.
Right.
You could hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Okay. Let's try this again. And if it tell me when there's a problem, I'll switch it off.
Sure.
Because I will now open the door wide open. Okay. So on the issue of health and education, it is really a puzzle. And particularly
we are losing you again, Dr. Mohan, sorry. Sorry, Dr. Mohan, losing you again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's slightly better. It's actually coming in and going out. So unfortunately, we're missing snippets of what you're saying.
Oh, that's what a pity. I'm not sure what I can do about it now, actually. Because usually...
let's try without the video. I know they'd rather see you rather than see my ugly face, but let's try and at least get
usually this spot is good, but today seems to be...
No problem. That's fine. Let's go ahead.
Okay, so I was saying that it is a puzzle on this lack of focus on health and education, particularly in a democratic polity. One would have thought that this would be a politically popular thing to do.
Right.
And to some extent, I think that the Delhi Chief Minister, Mr. Kejriwal, has proved this, that he has given special attention to health and education. And from whatever I can gather, that it's been relatively successful. With the clinics and the schools strengthening, etc. Sure. And it came out in this re-election by a landslide. Sure. So it is very puzzling, but the statistics are very sobering, which if you don't mind, I'll just mention right now. That the first most shocking statistic is that according to standardized international measurements, almost a third of Indian children to the age of 0 and 5 today are stunted.
Right.
It's a terrible thing to say. Of course, there are some people who say that, look, these measurements are not quite correct in terms of the Indian body structure, etc.
Sure.
Even if they're wrong, I mean, even if it's 20%, it's too high.
Sure.
And so that is and just in comparison, in the 1980s, say that till the mid to late 1980s, this was as high as 60%.
Wow.
And by the way, China was also around 40% at that time.
Right.
So what has happened now is that we still have about a third, now they're almost none. China is about 8% or so now.
Right.
Okay, but in the case of life expectancy, India and China was somewhat comparable in the early 1960s, with around between the mid 40s life expectancy at birth. Now we have improved to 69, and they've gone up to about 77. And there's similar differences in the rates of infant mortality. Again, one can go through many other data, but this kind of encapsulates that.
Right.
Now, what is striking is that despite of poverty, etc., that we have around the lowest levels of public expenditure on health in the world on a consistent basis. And this comprises about less than one third of health expenditure, which means that two-thirds of expenditures on health are private expenditures, and huge burden on poor people having to spend out of their pocket on health expenditures.
Right.
And of course, that really affects their well-being. Now, the other issue, I was talking water supply and sanitation, that if you look at the history, say, of the United States and other countries, it was understood very early on that the most effective expenditure on public health was to do with water supply and sanitation.
Right.
And again, that's been a total neglect until very recently in terms of Swachh Bharat and so on. But again, it's really puzzling because I've wrote this paper, as you mentioned, in honor of Mrs. Ahluwalia. She headed a high-level committee on urban infrastructure.
Right.
And she had calculated the investment required in water supply and sanitation, which came to around it came to, if I remember correctly, less than 0.5% of GDP on an annual basis to get clean water to all cities, not talking urban areas in that calculation. So the point is that this is doable, absolutely doable, once you put your mind to it, just like Swachh Bharat.
Right.
But we just have not done it. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you two questions out of this, Dr. Mohan, and we seem to be narrowing this down, right? So clearly we need a focus on growth, we need a focus on delivery of public goods, sanitation, healthcare, education, and we need a focus on manufacturing and labor-intensive employment, right? One part seems to be about funds. So as Dr. Ahluwalia has pointed out, maybe 0.5% of GDP, which is obviously pittance compared to what we require towards sanitation, etc. The second part is it also, so the first question is, do we have the funds for solving those problems? And what, in your opinion, should we do to generate those funds to invest in these areas? Okay, that's the first part. Second part is, I'm going to go back to what you mentioned about reforming the public sector in its widest sense. The way the administration is set up right now, is that coming in the way of actually achieving these goals, whether it is growth, whether it is public goods, and whether it is employment? Is our administration the problem?
Okay, well, again, let me tell me if I should put off my video
Sure.
if we run into problems. Okay, so first on the issue of resources,
Yeah.
There was a recent paper by my friend Sudipto Mandal and the co-author, which made calculations of how much we need to do proper provision of public provision of health, education, water supply, and sanitation.
Right.
And his calculations came to be almost 1% of GDP in terms of each of these areas.
Right.
So only about 3 to 4% of GDP that would be needed extra. Now, you're asking the question, look, where will the money come from? Okay. That's obviously a very, very important question. The puzzling thing, say, over the last 10, 12 years, since the late 2000s, that is 2008, 9 or thereabouts, is the tax GDP ratio has remained rock steady.
Right.
So in fact, again, prior to COVID, say 2019-20, the tax GDP ratio was actually lower than it was in 2007-8. Now, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, even voice is okay?
Yeah, can hear you.
Okay. Even as Arvind Subramaniam claims, has asserted that the growth numbers have been inflated, even if we assume that the average growth in the last 10, 12 years has been 5, 6% rather than 6, 7%, even then there should have been normal buoyancy in tax GDP ratio. As
Sure.
more and more people, and we can see that in the number of cars being sold, in the number of everything being sold, number of chocolates being sold, that is very clear that more and more people with much higher incomes, right? Therefore, both income tax, also, we've seen corporates expanding and so on. So whether it's corporate income tax, whether it's direct personal income tax, and whether it's indirect taxes, all should have gone up as a proportion of GDP. They have not.
Right.
One of the things I notice in that is that it's a very strange thing to say, especially for a former finance ministry official and a civil servant for most of my career, that the Indian government doesn't seem to be interested in collecting taxes, which is, for most people in the country, will curse me to saying that, because most people feel done in terms of the high taxes we pay, we're supposed to be paying. But just two examples, that whenever tax GDP ratio does well, as it did in 2007-8, we feel very rich in some sense in the government or the polity. And one of the things we did very quickly after the North Atlantic financial crisis in early 2009 was to cut SANVAT by 50%,
Right.
from I think it was 16 to 8 or something like that. Okay. Similarly, this past year, one of the things we have is that we have a very high income tax threshold. Very
Right.
interesting, by the way. This is what I mean by the government not being interested in collecting taxes. That the effective income tax threshold now for individual is 6.5 lakhs,
That's
including all the provisions. That's about $9,000 or thereabouts. Okay. In the US, with a per capita income of around 25 to 30 times ours, the threshold is just $13,000. Now, why is that important? Because what it does is that even a student in the US who gets a scholarship worth $30,000, $13,000, has to pay tax, that is non-tuition scholarship, so that you get used to paying tax. You've got to get people in quickly. So my point here is that as far as the resources are concerned, we just need to collect. We don't need to raise tax rates, etc. Another example is the giveaway we did on corporate tax rate last year, with the argument that this will lead to higher investment. Do you see any higher investment? I've been on a few boards of companies, and after the corporate tax rate, I didn't see any discussion of increase in investment intentions. So these are just a few examples. And then the other point I would say in terms of resources is that many people on the public finance side have made very good calculations of merit and non-merit subsidies.
sure.
So, and this goes together with this not wanting to tax, on the other hand, wanting to give away money. Again, I'm 100% in favor of merit subsidies, merit expenditures, health and education, etc. No question. 100% in favor of food subsidies for nutrition, etc. But there are so many other subsidies that totally, for example, the power sector,
Right.
on which CSEP does a lot of work.
Right.
So the point basically is that, to my mind, that if we need to spend, say, something like 3% of GDP more on some of these essential public services, health, education, etc., that it is feasible if we put our minds to it. And I think, again, I would say that having been in the government during a time that we did major reforms, that I would say that once our government puts our mind to it, whether it's 50s, 60s, whether it is 90s, 2000s, we can actually perform and we can actually do it. So I'm optimistic on that way.
So before we go into the administrative part, just on the tax and while I hear what you're saying, that the government can raise the resources required to fund this 3% that Dr. Mondal is saying is required. Here, given where we are on COVID and the fact that tax collections have collapsed and we have where we are, is it okay for the government to spend first and worry about tax collections later? I.e., can we push up the fiscal deficit by 3% more, spend that on things like nutrition, sanitation, infrastructure, and so on and so forth, and worry about the collection part later?
No, I think that we need to distinguish between what we need to do as a consequence of COVID,
right?
Which I'm really not talking about today.
Sure.
Okay, and what we need to do. Let's assume COVID goes away 6 months from now.
Right.
We will then need 21, 22 to recover from COVID.
Right.
I'm sort of talking about normality, say starting 22, 23.
Right.
In the meantime, yes, I would still say that as a consequence of COVID, particularly for health and education, we do need to step up expenditures because given the kind of privatization that has taken place of both health and education in the country,
right,
that there are many, many people who have lost their incomes, who would otherwise be quite happy in some sense to pay for the health and education needs, are now constrained.
Right.
And
Mohan, we're losing you again, otherwise.
COVID time expenditures is that we do those.
Sorry, Dr. Mohan, we're losing you again on the voice.
Am I back now?
You're back now, yes.
Okay. So what I was saying is COVID is that during the COVID time, we
right,
need to think about what are the problems that are arising today, which will have long-lasting impacts.
Right.
What are they? They can be nutrition issues, they can be education issues, they can be health treatment issues, and also perhaps bank loan defaults, etc. So I don't want to go too much on the COVID issue, but all I'm saying is that we do need to make these expenditures, and if necessary, we just have to increase the fiscal deficit.
So just to clarify, Dr. Mohan, sorry to interrupt. I'm not talking about COVID either. So assume that we are in FY22, where God willing, we are out of COVID and things are moving on, right? And we're starting, let's assume we are back to where we were in FY20, right? Before COVID hit us. And as you said, there is a deficit in terms of, let's say, 3% of GDP of investments required into health, sanitation, nutrition, education, and other kinds of infrastructure. You're right that we should be able to find the money to fund this. But especially given the world where economics seems to be changing, is it okay for us to print money first, spend it on infrastructure and sanitation and healthcare, etc., and then worry about collections coming thereafter after growth?
Well, this will always obviously have to be phased and coordinated.
Right.
Okay. If the deficit is increased for investment purposes, right, whether it's physical infrastructure or social infrastructure,
right.
There was a very good IMF paper in 2014, if I remember correctly, 2014-2015 World Economic Outlook publication, which had showed how borrowings for infrastructure investment pay for themselves over a period of time.
Sure.
Okay. So the whole point of what I'm saying today in terms of third generation reforms is that what you need to do is to focus public expenditure,
right,
towards productive activities, which then bring in more private sector investment,
sure,
which is being constrained, whether it's because of lack of health expenditures, whether lack of infrastructure expenditures, urban development expenditures, etc. But obviously this has to be phased and coordinated. Sure. So I think it's feasible to do.
Right. Fair enough, Dr. Mohan. I want to now go to the second part of the question that I mentioned earlier, which is around, is the administration coming in the way of us achieving successes with respect to growth, with respect to public services, sanitation, healthcare, etc., and employment? You mentioned the Niti Aayog and Planning Commission several times. Is our bureaucracy and administration and the political infrastructure coming in the way of delivery of of these objectives?
Yeah. So let me just first give us on the public administration. Our current structure of administration, um, 70 years after independence,
Right.
continues to have the colonial structure that we inherited.
Right.
And the substantive brief point is that the colonial structure was designed to economize administration, and they were not interested in development at all.
Right.
It was designed for control purposes, administrative control purposes. So that you have district level administrators
Right.
who are state government employees or central government employees, and they move around. Similarly, both at the central and state secretariat levels as well, it's the same administrators. There's
Right.
very little domain expertise in different areas. Now, as it happens, because these are bright fellows, given the selection procedures, because they're bright fellows, things kind of have been working.
Right.
But one of the differences between the successful countries and us is that I would say that they've not had this kind of colonial structure.
Right.
There's much greater local responsibility, local governments and state governments.
Right.
So, for example, the only 3% of government employees in India
Right.
are local government employees. In the US, it's something like 27%.
Right.
And in China, it's something like 50%, something of the order. I forget the exact numbers.
Right.
So, this is a very important issue that, see, the size of our district, the average size of our districts
Right.
is larger than 50 countries in the world.
Right.
Average size of our district. So you just have to have much more public presence in terms of delivering of public services.
Right.
Now, this is a very difficult issue. So I'm not at all pretending, look, this is easy to do. Okay.
Right.
But we first have to recognize that there's a problem. And only then can you start solving the problem. Again, some other numbers in terms of the government. As I mentioned, that there's a lack of technocratic competence.
Right.
At every level, and that needs to be addressed. In terms of numbers,
Yeah.
there are only about 1.6 government employees per 1,000 in India.
Right.
Western commentators, particularly magazines and newspapers, are very fond of saying bloated Indian bureaucracy.
Right.
They should look at their own.
Right.
There are 1.6 government employees per 1,000 in India, about 8 per 1,000 in the United States.
Wow.
Okay, and that's self-declared most capitalist economy in the world.
Right.
Also, interestingly, relative to 1991,
Right.
there's been a fall in public employment about 5% in government employment.
Right.
Population has increased by 40%
Right.
since 1991. Even in the case of the Reserve Bank,
Right.
the number of officers, that is the technical people, has fallen in the last 10 years.
Right.
When the financial sector has expanded like mad.
Sure.
So I'm just also, even of the strength of government that exists, apparently 20% of all government positions are vacant at any given time.
Right.
A third of High Court judges, a
Sure.
fifth of Supreme Court judges, quarter of district judges. Even in the best institutions, 1/3 of faculty positions of IITs are generally vacant. So
Right.
it's no wonder that the government doesn't perform and deliver public services. So that's, it's a snapshot. There are many other details. One can argue about that, but there are many other things one can say. So what do we need to do?
Right.
First, we do need to make public service prestigious again.
Right.
relative to the private sector. Not for the exercise of power and authority. Let's try again. Not for the purpose of exercising power and authority, but for tackling the challenges of effective public services.
Right.
We also need to have much more lateral entry at all levels, actually. At the same time, there is a value, absolute value, to a permanent civil service at all levels.
Sure.
There's no question. And so that has to be an approved balance. But they ought to be in and out. Building of domain expertise at all levels. It doesn't mean technical expertise.
Right.
It does mean domain expertise.
Right.
So there are many, this is a very complicated issue. But my main point is that the first thing has to be recognition of the problem.
Right.
And then tackling. There have been, of course, various administrative reform commissions. Nothing has happened.
Right.
But I do believe that unless we do these things, we have no chance of ascending to a higher growth path. And essentially for the purpose of the government doing what it's supposed to do, which is to deliver public services, whether it's sanitation and sewerage, whether it is the construction of roads, whether it's delivery of health, education services, regulatory authority services for that matter, and so on. And every successful country has done that.
Right. So, Dr. Mohan, you've scared me now. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. One is something which I see coming up in the chat. Why are there so many vacancies in government jobs, in education institutions like IITs, in judiciary postings, etc.? So, why do you reckon there is so much of gaps in the administration? Second, which is a larger question I have in my mind. This is scary stuff. If you're saying the delivery of goods and the public goods and public services, growth as well as of manufacturing and jobs, it requires significant changes to the administrative mechanism, both in terms of external expertise, domain expertise, as well as in terms of going away from the colonial set that we have into a more decentralized, I guess, structure of administration. Who's going to bell the cat? Doesn't the change have to come from within? Isn't the administration required to make these changes? And is the administration at all incentivized to make these changes?
Well, I don't really have a good answer to this, but I can give an analogy, which is that the 91 reforms,
right.
I was then in the industry ministry, and we did the industrial policy reform 1991. We dismantled, right, or so many in one shot, so many of the controls which empowered our bureaucracy.
Right.
So it was a bureaucracy itself which dismantled various controls, which gave them huge power and authority. So I think it's feasible to do once the ideas are put across, right, and there's top-level commitment. So, for example, we abolished the what is then known as the DGTD, the Director General of Technical Development,
right,
which was the major control mechanism Ministry of Industry. Right. I can tell you, I was cursed like mad by those people as economic advisor who had proposed these things. But my point is that because there was a commitment from the top, similarly, I mean, much later on, after all, the Department of Telecom first corporatized the BSNL, MTNL and BSNL. Right. And of course, it should be done. And then basically all the mobile telephony is all private.
Sure.
So the government has given up things. But at the same time, yes, of course, I agree with you. And one area, one organization which has really resisted is the railways.
Right.
That I had the privilege of chairing a committee on the railways reforms, which gave us a report in 2001, almost 20 years ago. Right. We then recommended a major railways reform of corporatizing the railways with the idea that we have to really expand the railways. But the railways bureaucracy has successfully resisted that right through. I see some changes going on now, in terms of some recommendations we gave, but they're still nowhere near corporatizing it. So I don't have a good answer to you, Ananth, but I think that I still believe that if there's a top level interest, and again, it has to be technocratic. By technocratic, I mean that there has to be full understanding. Look, this is what we are doing. You have to understand the vested interests. They have to be taken care of.
Right.
And I think it can be done.
Right. In fact, Dr. Mohan, I was just reading Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia's book Backstage, where he speaks of you in glowing terms, by the way. And some of the stuff that you mentioned, Fines are mentioned in that book as well. Here's my question to you on the changes that you mentioned in 1991. And you're right, you were making changes which effectively, in a sense, made you less important, right? Was the instigation from the political side? Was there clear political signals which pushed you and pushed the bureaucracy as a whole, not you as a person, to make these changes? Is that the starting point for these meaningful changes to come about?
No, I wouldn't say there was a political push, but what I would say is two things actually. One, that the previous 10 years, right through the 1980s, there was an emerging intellectual push for making those changes, particularly in response to what happened in East Asia, Southeast Asia.
Right.
Number one. Three things. Number two, fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And
Right.
number three, of course, the crisis that we had,
Sure.
the balance payments, the economic crisis that we had.
Sure.
So that obviously pushed that. And then as it happened, once all this was taking place, there was a total commitment from the top. That is then Prime Minister Rao and Finance Minister Manmohan Singh. But the important, so it's a triple thing that happened. One was a confluence of thinking. Two was the impact of Southeast Asia, East Asia. Three, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And four, of course, the crisis. So there was a confluence of thinking that did take place.
Right. Hopefully, we don't have to wait for a full-fledged blown-out crisis before we get to those reforms.
One thing I do want to mention in terms of something that hasn't happened as a consequence of reform, which we expected to happen. And that is, we had thought that once we do all these reforms, do open trade, remove the controls, and make the system much more market-oriented, that that we will then generate much more employment-intensive, labor-intensive manufacturing, reflecting our comparative advantage. And that hasn't happened. And I remain puzzled on why that hasn't happened. But I think one of the things I mentioned right at the beginning, that a key crisis today, the key crisis to do is to do with employment. Sure. And therefore, that we can't grow the way we want to grow unless there's a huge expansion of labor using manufacturing, which is basically light manufacturing, and which has to be export oriented. Now, one of the things that is said today is, look, we've missed the bus. I don't believe that at all, for two reasons. One, that all the projections for the next 20 years suggest that 80% of global growth is going to come from Asia.
Right.
And also 80% of trade growth will come from Asia.
Right.
Therefore, there's a huge market for consumer goods that is coming up. Sure. On a continuous basis of about 3 billion people, in addition to our own 1.4 billion people.
Sure.
So just think of if 4 billion people buy one shirt extra a year, or one pair of shoes extra a year, or one pair of glasses, whatever you take, that there's a huge consumer market that is there for the next 20 years, greater than the growth in consumer market that has taken place the last 20 years in the world. So there's no shortage. Therefore, we have to be much more oriented towards Asia, look at export opportunities, including to China, because they're going to vacate the low technology activities. And therefore, I think that this is of the utmost importance. We have missed one bus, which is joining the RCEP, which I think is a major error. And I think that we have to correct that because that's what the market is, whether we like it or not.
Sure. No, I want to stay on this subject, Dr. Mohan, and you're absolutely right. I completely agree with you. I think you can't say we've missed the bus. There is a lot of opportunity still. But here is the brutal facts, Dr. Mohan. In fact, you mentioned this in your paper. The fact that our competitiveness in areas like textiles and in footwear, for instance, where we should have a natural advantage, is not playing out in terms of manufacturing from India. What is it that has stopped us from being competitive in such areas in terms of actually manufacturing things like ready-made garments and footwear, and where we should have a natural advantage? Second is, we are seeing some changes now, right? So last year, and you mentioned this in a different context, we saw corporate taxes being cut in a bid to try and get in the supply chains from China, amongst other things. We now have labor reforms which have been announced. We also have this production-linked incentives for electronics as a means to try and give a fillip to electronics manufacturing in India. Do you think that we are now heading in the right direction? Maybe we've learned the lessons from the past. Make in India didn't seem to have worked, but Atmanirbhar Bharat, is that the right path? Are we on the right path to getting manufacturing and jobs back in the system?
Well, I hope that some of these things work better than they have before. However, one thing that we have gone in the opposite direction is increase in protection. One thing that we know well as economists is that protection does not promote efficient industry, and it certainly won't promote exports. Therefore, that to my mind, that we will not succeed in export competitive industry unless we reverse some of the protection that has taken place. One thing I do find of interest here is that a lot of the protection, also the the production linked incentives, etc., amount to around 10%.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And 10% actually is lower than many people's calculation of the overvaluation of our exchange rate.
Right.
And so I think that much more attention needs to be given on maintaining a realistic exchange rate, which indeed can be done. We know how to do that. I can sort of, given the overvalued exchange rate, as many people have calculated, it's not surprising that industry feels that they need the tariff protection. The tariff protection, most of it has been given is around 10%. So I think that there are ways to solve this, but we have to be, again, much more, that it has to be done through much more understanding of the data, much more understanding of where we have difficulties and competence. I think there are also some other things to do with infrastructure, particularly urban infrastructure.
Right.
That even in Bangladesh, where when I was the executive director of the IMF, I represented Bangladesh along with India.
Right.
And so I visited there a few times and went to some in-garment factories. And what is interesting is some of the better garment factories are actually 20 to 30 floor structures, very modern.
Right.
We don't have any 20, 30 floor structures, to my knowledge, concentrated in big cities with very good facilities, etc. So I think that there are many issues to do with location of industry also, of course, while keeping pollution issues in mind and so on. But I think that there are issues here which can be solved and where we can get competitiveness in many of these areas as well.
Right. I'm going to take a couple of audience questions, Dr. Mohan. I realize we're coming close to the end of the hour. One we have from Mridul Sagar. He basically speaks of the various kinds of reforms that you've been speaking about, education, sanitation, higher taxes for funding public services, agriculture, labor reforms, etc. His broad question is, what is your view on these legislations, these labor reforms, etc.? And why is there political opposition to this? Is there some economic rationale behind the opposition, or is it pure private rent seeking that is driving this opposition?
Well, I have to say that I'm not 100% familiar with the details of the legislative changes that have taken place.
Right.
But I would make a broader comment because I'm among the people who have been advocating labor reforms in this direction for a long time. But I've also always advocated that this has to be done along with the increase in social security. That is,
Right.
if you had a certain system of protection, labor protection,
Right.
then when we are changing that, we need to provide adequate social security to the people affected. So there has to be much, much more consultation
Right.
and provision of protection so that people understand that if I'm affected by this, I will not suffer. Second, also I think better explanation, even if it is the labor unions that are objecting, that look, if we do this, because of the following reasons, because of the following activities, employment in manufacturing will expand by a factor of 3 or a factor of 4,
Right.
whatever it may be, which means that your unions will be much stronger rather than weaker.
Oh.
You have nothing to fear. I would also say that given the numbers being so small, that our organized sector manufacturing is, I think, less than 15 million still. Okay. The organized sector manufacturing employment in China, I don't know what is the number right now, but it used to be at least more than 100 million. Okay. So even if we do something like 40% of that, right, 40 million, it's a multiple of what we have today. So I think that there has to be a campaign of information, understanding of their problems. You can even give complete protection to all existing employees. It's to, for example, in the civil service, when we moved from a defined benefit pension to defined contribution in 2005 or there, 2004 or 5 or thereabouts, if I remember correctly, or was it 2002, something like that. What did we do? We gave 100% protection to all existing government employees, that their defined benefit pensions continued forever, of which I am a beneficiary. But all new people were on a different system. You can do the same thing. You can protect all existing employees if necessary. So all I'm saying is that I think these kind of reforms, which are absolutely necessary in the interest of manufacturing, need to be done in such a way that people's fears are addressed. Now, of course, I don't mean to say that, look, everyone will be convinced. They won't. Just like we did reforms in the 90s, where a lot of industry was afraid. But they
You
understood that it was in their interest, and they then participated huge amount of.
right. Dr. Mohan, I've got last couple of questions for you again from the audience. On this focus on delivery of public services, healthcare, sanitation, education, etc. There is some work happening, right? So you talked about Swachh Bharat, for instance. Then you have this new education policy which has come up. Likewise, we have Modi Care, the Ayushman Bharat, etc. And as you mentioned, the Delhi government seems to be taking a lot of good steps on education and healthcare as well at a primary level. Are these steps in the right direction? Do you think we're doing enough? Or do you think much more is required?
First, let me say I don't know enough about them in the sense of numbers. That is, I don't have a good understanding yet, partly because I've been away for a long time, of the numbers to the Ayushman Bharat, how much the government is going to spend, how the services will be provided, and so on. One thing I do have great concern is that there has been an increasing movement in the last 30 years towards greater and greater private provision in both education and health. And on the health side, we are moving towards an insurance system. One thing we know from the United States, 100% we know, relative to Europe, is that medical insurance systems do not help and work for the poor. Even in the US, about 20, 30 million people are not covered. And that remains a huge political issue. because there the majority are covered, and so it's a problem.
Right.
One fact on that, by the way, is that what is interesting is that in Europe, where medicine is basically socialized,
Right.
total public expenditure is around 8-9% of GDP. What is interesting is in the US also, total public expenditure on health is around the same number, 8-9%. It's just that there's a similar number, there is 8-9% of private expenditure. So in other words, the US spends around 16 to 18% of GDP on health, about double what Europe spends,
Right.
with not as good outcomes in almost any metric.
Sure.
So, similarly, education. One thing I must mention is that almost all countries of any note, including all developed countries, provide free education up to the secondary level, including the United States, the most capitalistic country in the world. We are going the opposite way. Now it's going on. So I'm not saying at all, look, shut these things down. Not at all, because they are there. One good aspect of this is that people, by spending the money, are telling you that they place high priority education, they're willing to spend on it. The way to go is really focus on improving public education. And if what people tell me is true about what Mr. Kejriwal has done, of course, I have no direct knowledge, then it's feasible to do. And again, something encouraging is that what has improved in education is huge increase in numbers in the last 20 years.
Right.
So that we do have almost 100% enrolled in primary schools. We know the problems in the actual achievements with our surveys. So then the good part of it is that, look, we've tackled the quantity problem, but we now have to tackle the delivery and quality problem. And once again, I would say that this is where the government has to concentrate. And we really do, that no country in the world has done well without 100% provision of free education up to the secondary level.
And this goes back to the point you're making about the cost of the fisc will not be that much. And the government should have the ability to raise the resources to fund all of this. And I guess this should be the path going forward. One final question to you, Dr. Mohan, from what has been a very fascinating discussion. You're back in India now after a stint outside, and if you run into the Prime Minister's office or the Prime Minister himself, what would you suggest? You've given us a lot of overview of what needs to be done, but 2 or 3 things that you would suggest immediately, and 2 or 3 things that you would suggest for more long term, as key things that that we should focus on as concrete steps going forward.
First, I wouldn't be presumptuous enough to tell the Prime Minister or any high functionary on what to do. And I'm saying this with sincerity, in the sense that, having been abroad mostly for the last 10 years, it would be presumptuous of me to say, look, I know this how to do it. So I have, as you've seen during this discussion, that I do think I have a reasonable idea of what needs to be done, what directions we need to go, but on how, I think I'm weak. Because now I've been out of government and I've frozen again. Hear me now? Can you hear me again now?
Yeah, your video is frozen, but yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. So what I would say is that what I would like to see, which I've said through this discussion, one, a very clear articulation of the view that, look, economic growth is number one, because without economic growth, we can't do many of the welfare activities that we want to do and we must do. Number two, in order to do that, we have to have a centralized system, possibly through a technocratic strengthening of the Niti Aayog, of how we articulate this vision, how we draw up a strategy, and how we coordinate, and how we communicate.
Right.
It has to be a much more consensual activity between different parts of the central government, between the central government and state governments, and a new activity in some sense much more between state governments and local governments.
Right.
And at each level, much more technocratic strengthening. 3, a very, very clear commitment that we are committed to providing 100% of resources for everyone for primary and secondary health and education, with whether it is delivered directly by the government or possibly the provision can be from the private sector, from non-profits, etc. But a commitment that over some period of time, like 5 or 10 years, that look, don't worry, you will not be spending out of pocket on these activities.
Right.
And that incidentally will also free up money for higher tax revenues, by the way.
Sure.
That is, if households are spending a third of their incomes on these things, they won't then be spending a third of income on these things.
Sure.
And fourth, of course, real emphasis on employment, because one of the things I should have mentioned is that the emphasis on manufacturing employment, on overall employment, also means that one of the problems that we've had is that whereas the share of agriculture and output has come down to 15% of GDP or less, employment is still around 50%. And so that obviously there's huge distress in agriculture. And that can only be reduced if people are taken away from agriculture. That can only happen if non-agricultural employment increases.
Right. Perfect, Dr. Mohan. I don't think I could have asked for a better summary. So you spared me the task of summarizing what you've discussed, but I will take notes and I will send them across to you and all the participants separately on what's been a fantastic discussion. Clear focus on growth, on delivery of public services, education, nutrition, healthcare, sanitation, a clear emphasis on labor-intensive manufacturing for job creation, and of course an overhaul of the public administration, both with a more technocratic, central, consensual planning, as you call it, along with the devolution of power and decentralization in terms of delivery. I think that's a fantastic overview the house of this hopefully should flow from this, given that you've given the guiding lights. So truly appreciate this, Dr. Mohan. Much appreciate both you as well as the Center for Social Economic Progress for doing this session. We should continue this conversation beyond this as well. And I look forward to seeing the paper on your public website the next week, and thereafter, of course, in its book form. There are lots of other questions which have come up from participants, which I'll separately send across to you for them. For instance, on delivery of healthcare and education, could we use fintech and digital modes? I'm sure that's a great area by itself for a lot of discussion. But we are completely out of time. It's already 6:15, so apologies for that. And again, thanks everybody for signing in on behalf of SPJIMR Center for Financial Studies and the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Many thanks for joining in and for your participation. Dr. Mohan, thanks again, once again, and look forward to continuing our discussions. And good evening.
Thank you, and I'm sorry for the poor quality of internet. That's beyond one's control.
Beyond our control, so that's absolutely fine. See you, sir. Take care. Cheers.